Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tom Bliss. I am the co-author of Mirror of Intimacy with Alexandra Katahakis. This book is available on Amazon, 88 copies left of the hardcover. And today we're with Noah Levine, and he's going to be talking about a Buddhist perspective on sex, sexuality, romance, and intimacy. First, real quick about Center for Healthy Sex. We are a sex therapy center in West Los Angeles. We specialize in sex addiction, love addiction, couples counseling, and sexual dysfunction. And we offer group therapy, individual therapy, and intensive outpatient programs. So feel free to call us anytime if you have any interest in our programs or want us to refer you to someone local in your area. Our number is 310-843-9902. And you can also look us up online, centerforhealthysex.com. So I'm really excited to bring on today Noah Levine. He's a Buddhist teacher. He's an author, counselor, recognized keynote speaker. He's the author of a lot of excellent books, Refuge Recovery, Dharma Punks, Against the Stream and Heart of the Revolution. And he's been teaching meditation internationally for over a decade, one of the key teachers in the West to deliver the message of Buddhism and mindfulness. He's been applying Buddhist practices in his own recovery since 1988, and he's an expert in the field of addiction treatment, recovery, and mindfulness-based therapies. He has a master's degree in counseling psychology from California Institute of Integral Studies, and he was trained as a Buddhist teacher by Jack Kornfield of Spirit Rock Meditation Center. He is the founding teacher of Against the Stream, Buddhist Meditation Society, and they have active centers in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and with 20 affiliated groups or more across North America. He's also on the board of directors for the Mind-Body Awareness Project, and it's a nonprofit that teaches meditation to incarcerated youth. So welcome, Noah.
Thanks. Happy to be here and happy to do this with you guys and your community. And really a pleasure to get the opportunity to, reflect on and do some teachings on Buddhist perspectives on sexuality and relationships and intimacy and romance. I'd like to just start by acknowledging that I personally have found it sometimes a bit challenging to be very serious about Buddhism and kind of original Buddhism, and to have a teacher who was celibate and who chose to not be engaged in sexual romantic relationships, to have and when I say a teacher, I mean the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, who 2,600 years ago discovered mindfulness and so radically changed his relationship to pleasure and pain and the mind or the self that he attained what we call enlightenment. And part of his experience of coming to this awakening was that he lost interest in sexuality and practiced celibacy and actually encouraged others to practice celibacy. So I want to come back to that and my own personal relationship to that as somebody who doesn't practice celibacy and who's engaged in relationships, and how some of the confusion that can bring when we're really committed to being awake and to not causing or experiencing suffering, but also wanting to be engaged in the sensual and or relational material world. From a Buddhist perspective, the Buddha outlined his teachings quite simply and quite straightforward. He said, the first thing that we all have to understand is the truth of suffering or dissatisfaction or the difficult experience that we've all taken birth into. We've taken birth into this body that craves for pleasure, that has a procreation instinct and drive. We've taken birth into this world where everything is impermanent, constantly changing, and so we're constantly subject to that impermanence and change. And so this first noble truth of suffering is just an acknowledgement that it's, there's so much craving for pleasure, but all pleasure is impermanent. And so there's this constant loss that we're all experiencing and change. And so the first, the Buddha begins by saying, okay, there is suffering and there's a cause of suffering, the second noble truth. And the second noble truth is that we all have this repetitive craving. Maybe it's as simple as our survival instinct, which is that we crave for pleasure and we hate pain, and we spend most of our lives trying to obtain pleasant experience and trying to maintain it. But as it turns out, it's actually impossible to maintain pleasure, and that's one of the reasons why we suffer loss, why we suffer grief, and why there's this kind of repetitive craving that often leads people into unhealthy behaviors or even addictions or extra level of suffering, which of course was my experience as a recovering drug addict. And so if the core cause of human suffering is attachment to and craving for pleasure, the Buddha does go on and says, through a wise and healthy relationship, a wise attitude, through meditative training of our minds and our hearts, we can come to a place where we don't suffer, where we're free from suffering and all of the causes of suffering. But when we're going to talk about sexuality, I think that it's pretty easy to see sexuality as the most pleasant human experience for most people. It's the most sensual pleasure that we can experience. And so, and then there's the deep sense of maybe even a drive for procreation in most people, where it's not only craving the pleasure, but the craving the, kind of primal reproduction cycle. The Buddha did speak directly about sexuality over and over in his teachings. And as I said in the beginning, he chose a path of celibacy. In one teaching, the Buddha says, this craving for sex, and when I say sex, I'm also talking about intimacy and romance and intrigue and, the attention that goes along, not just the act of sex, but all of the sexuality around it. He said, it's such a powerful, natural human experience that, and that everyone suffers about it on one level or another. And he says, if you're really committed to alleviating all forms of suffering from your life, then for most, it's a good choice to become celibate, to say, there's so much attachment here because it's so pleasant, because it's so many drives around it. And so I kind of want to just point that out, that from a Buddhist perspective, celibacy is a very wholesome and wise choice that many people take. Many of my meditation teachers have been celibate for 40 or 50 years. They got interested in Buddhism, they became monks, and they stopped engaging in sexuality. And the level of happiness that they have been able to attain is profound. And so, talking about sex from a Buddhist perspective, I love doing it. I'm happy. I've got a lot of thoughts about it. And there's this strange setup where there can be almost a little bit of a hierarchy that says, well, if you're really serious about happiness and freedom on this Buddhist path, then maybe celibacy is the best choice. And I feel like it's a setup that's actually saying, perhaps it'll be easier to be happy if you're celibate. than if you're engaging in sexuality. Now, I think this is a pretty radical perspective, and of course, I'm going to be interested in people's thoughts about this. I think that most of us, the ordinary attitude is that, yeah, you just have sex, or you're just engaged, and celibacy sounds like it would be too difficult, or some kind of extreme renunciation. I myself spent a couple of years practicing total celibacy, no masturbation, no intentional sexual activity at all, and I found that period of celibacy to be very healing and very important for me. And I had a lot of insights around the difference between desire and craving, and I'll come back to that. But so from a Buddhist perspective, celibacy is a viable option. And those of us who are choosing to not be celibate, and I feel like that's where I really want the conversation to land, is that sexuality is a choice. And that if we're choosing it, we're not quite as, that we're signing up for all of the challenges that go along with choosing to be sexual. Now, I see that there's a question coming in about Tantra as sacred sexuality as the middle path. The information that I have is that the Buddha never taught anything about Tantra. Tantra was an ancient Hindu practice, and then it was something that later Buddhists, Mahayana, maybe Tibetan Buddhists, sort of borrowed from the ancient Hindu and incorporated into Tibetan Buddhism. That having been said, what the Buddha did say was, he said, this path to end suffering, to change our relationship to pleasure and pain and self-centeredness, he said the core intervention, the core practice is mindfulness. Present time awareness of your body, of your emotions, sensations, of your mind, where all of the craving and clinging and aversion, judgments, it all arises here in this mind. And the Buddha's teaching, he said, in order to end suffering in this life, we're going to have to bring present time awareness, mindfulness. We have to turn inward, turning our direction towards our own sensations, our own thoughts, emotions. And through this inward awareness, we begin to understand everything's impermanent. Every sensation, every craving, every emotion is all impermanent. Now, the more we see impermanence clearly, the more we learn to let go. And this mindfulness really drastically changes our relationship to pleasure and pain, because we wake up to this pleasure is not going to be the source of happiness. And especially if there's any clinging to it, if there's attachment to pleasure, then actually pleasure not only does not make us happy, it actually creates stress. We create the suffering of clinging to impermanent experience, whether that's a relationship or a sense pleasure or any experience at all. If there's attachment, there is some suffering around that. So the Buddha says, bring this mindfulness, and this is what we do. It's what I've been doing for 28 years now, practicing mindfulness. And it helps us to change our relationship to pleasure and to sexuality and to relationships and to understandings that all relationships are subject to impermanence and loss. Even the happily ever after relationship eventually ends. So then we enter into relationships with this wisdom that says, oh, this is impermanent. It's, the pleasure is going to be wonderful if I can find a healthy way to relate to it, but it's not going to be the source of my happiness. From a Buddhist perspective, we're responsible for a kind of inner happiness that's not dependent on any sense pleasure at all. But in these teachings on mindfulness, and this is connected to the question on Tantra, the Buddha says, bring this embodied present time awareness into any activity of the body. So for those of us who are choosing to not follow a path of celibacy and to choose a sexual engaged life, of course the instructions is to be mindful in your sexuality, and that sexuality actually becomes maybe what is often referred to as tantra, where it's a meditative practice. We're bringing present time awareness, investigation to sensual pleasures, to relationships, to the craving for relationships, to the attachment that happens in relationships, to the aversion, the conflict. All of the experience of relationships becomes part of our mindfulness practice. So in that way, I do feel like what sometimes is referred to as Tantra is taught by early Buddhism, although he never uses that term, and he's not explicit about sexuality in the way that like the Kama Sutra or some of the Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhist teachings are. Early Buddhism isn't explicit in that way, but it's implied. There's two places or several places where the Buddha talks about the importance of being wise and careful around the sexual energy. At one point, it's said that the Buddha said he thought that sex was the most powerful human experience there was, and perhaps the most powerful cause of suffering in human existence. It said that he said something like, if there was something else as powerful as sex and sexuality in the human experience, that enlightenment would not be possible, that nobody would be able to get free. He said, but we can, through our mindfulness, through our discipline, we can develop a healthy relationship. And whether that's deciding to be celibate or it's deciding to engage with, and I think that with all pleasure, and especially sexuality, the ideal from a Buddhist perspective is non-attached appreciation of pleasure. And so the intention is to go into a relationship with love and connection and trying to show up in that experience without suffering about it, without clinging to it. Now, I have a sense that my own experience is that I've been trying to do that now for 25, almost 30 years, and that I've never been able to have a sexual relationship where I'm just connected, right? And so non-attachment is this, right? It's connection. Now, so often we're clinging, and we're trying to cling and control and keep and make the person, place, thing, experience. We're trying to manipulate it rather than just connecting to this consensual connection that becomes sexual. And then sometimes we suffer about that clinging, and so then we detach. We separate ourselves and we say, oh, that hurt, so I'm going to avoid it. And I had a question here that said something about, some might say those who choose to be celibate is a way to avoid intimacy and live in denial. And what are my thoughts about that? And I think that absolutely, that sometimes when we're doing celibacy as detachment, as avoidance, as that's not necessarily the healthy choice. And it's one of the reasons why I myself didn't choose to continue being celibate. I did feel that I had a lot to learn in relationships, and actually a lot of healing to do in relationships that maybe I wasn't going to be able to do as a celibate. And that so I absolutely think that sometimes celibacy can be an avoidance. But I also do not think that it's always that. I think that some people that have a spiritual aspiration, because actually being a monk or a nun, often there's a lot of intimacy that happens. They're living in community, they're living with each other. There's a lot of connections. It's not an avoidance altogether. It's a very intimate, it's just not a sexual relationship. And I have another question here that I'll address before I continue. And that question says, if the pursuit of Buddhism is to shred selfishness, isn't choosing to be celibate a choice to pursue the unilateral fulfillment that results from not craving? How is that not selfish? No disrespect. It's just a bit confusing. Let me see if I understand this. If choosing to be celibate is a choice to pursue unilateral fulfillment that results from not craving, not selfish. So let me see if I can reflect on that. My sense is that the Buddha's teachings are that we can, through our own efforts in this lifetime, free ourselves from the causes of suffering. So I don't know that it's so much about to shed selfishness. Of course, selfishness can be a cause of suffering, but that from a Buddhist perspective, it's considered a very healthy aspiration or goal to say, I want to be free from suffering. I want to free myself from the clinging, the craving, the selfishness that causes suffering. But it's considered a wholesome desire, a wholesome goal to end suffering and any activities that lead to suffering. So I think that from a Buddhist perspective, we'd even, sometimes people ask this question in like, well, I really crave for enlightenment, right? I used to crave for pleasure and now I crave for enlightenment. Is that okay? On some level, from a Buddhist perspective, it's like the most wholesome thing because, the meditation practice, the discipline, the renunciation that will come from that. What he's talking about, this question is talking about unilateral fulfillment of the result of not craving. That's actually a very wholesome thing to want, and that won't even benefit us personally. There's that actually, as we end suffering in our life, we have that much more energy to serve others. The Buddha was somebody who practiced celibacy and came to his own awakening, and then he spent his whole life, like 50 years, being of service. And not being selfish at all. He went around the country and spoke out against sexism and the oppression of women, and spoke out against racism and the oppression, that's the caste system in India. And he, was politically engaged. And I found this also in my celibacy, when I wasn't engaging in sexuality and when I wasn't seeking sexuality, I had so much more energy to be of service. I had so much of that, like rather than looking to have a relationship or get laid or something, I was able to use my life's energy for service in a really engaged way. And so my sense is that those who choose celibacy for the right reasons, not as a avoidance, but as a discipline, actually can really use their life's energy in a way that is not selfish, but that is almost completely altruistic at times. So we find ourselves in this conversation about Buddhist perspectives on sexuality and this human dilemma of being born into a body that clings, into a mind that clings, into this survival instinct that is going to get attached. And and I had said that in some ways, Buddhism would look at celibacy as a noble and maybe even higher choice. But I also feel like those of us who are choosing to be engaged in sexuality but still committed to the kind of freedom of non-attachment, that it's actually an even more difficult choice of saying, like, I'm going to really enter into this arena that that I know I'm going to suffer in. I know I'm going to get attached. I know there's going to be grief and loss, and I'm going to fully engage with that, and I'm going to develop as much compassion as I can for the pain, and as much non-attachment as I can for the pleasure, and I'm going to try to develop an attitude of equanimity with sexuality that enjoys all of the pleasant experiences and accepts all of the unpleasant conflicts or losses that are part of it, and use sexuality really as a spiritual practice. Another question here I'll try to address. It says, for me, sexual attachment without obsessive clinging is a fine line. As a man in recovery, attachment or healthy attachment is my goal for me in relationship. Attachment without obsession is the real work. And so I love that. It's not really a question, it's more of a comment. But that's, that's it. We talk about healthy attachment, and there's the attachment theory stuff of psychology, and it becomes semantics a little bit. The Buddha, the way that we think about it in original early Buddhism is that there's no such thing as a healthy attachment. There's, and it's just wording, but that any attachment causes suffering. And that in relationships, and I've already done this, but that in relationships, it's connection, right? It's not attachment. And that anytime we do this, anytime we're attached or clinging, we're suffering. Even when it's mutual, right? Because it's just, there's two desire systems, two minds, and they're just not going to always be aligned. So when we're clinging, there's some, rub, kind of some separation. But that healthy, what we call healthy attachment, from a Buddhist perspective, is actually non-attachment. The healthy way to be in a relationship is to be connected without clinging and without detaching or separating from. And I think that that's what's meant in attachment theory by healthy attachment. It's actually healthy non-attachment, healthy non-clinging. And I think one of the other ways that Buddhism helps when we're talking about the obsession and this comment about without obsession, my sense is that sometimes the mind obsesses all by itself. The more that I've meditated, and I think the more that anybody meditates, the more we come to have some equanimity with the mind and some understanding that what arises in the mind isn't all personal, and that the mind can even be obsessing. And when you're mindful and you're turning towards your mind, you're observing it, you're being with it, you can see, oh, the mind's really obsessing, but not be involved, not be identified, not be taking the obsessive thought personal, and being able to bring awareness to it and say, like, oh, the mind is just doing this, thinking about this person or this experience or having this repetitive craving. And so that's one of the, I'd say that mindfulness in all areas of our life leads to three big skills. And of course, these skills are invaluable in relationship. And that first skill is what I'm talking about, which is understanding how impersonal a lot of what happens in the mind is, which leads to the ability to choose what thoughts do we get involved with, and which ones do we just say, oh, okay, my mind's obsessing again. And so breaking the addiction to the mind and the identification with the mind, and being able to have enough room in our awareness that even when obsessive thought is present, we're not suffering about it a lot. We're just bringing more mindfulness to it. Okay, obsessive thought, craving, or fear, or whatever we're obsessing on. So that's it. And then, the more we bring awareness into our body and heart and mind, the more we develop compassion. And out of compassion for ourselves and for our own suffering, out of compassion for others and their suffering, and then a greater altruistic sense of compassion that eventually spreads to the whole world, where there's a feeling of love and kindness and compassion for all living beings. And so that comes out of our meditative investigation. And then third is non-attachment, non-clinging. And it doesn't mean detachment, and it doesn't mean avoidance, and it doesn't mean denial or suppression. That what non-attachment means in sexuality is being able to enter into a relationship in a honest way, in a wise way, consensual, and enjoying the pleasure, the appropriate pleasures, and doing our best to not get addicted to them, not get attached to them. And when we find ourselves addicted or attached, to bring the appropriate intervention, which for some people will mean, either setting those bottom line behaviors or actually abstaining. I think I might be, from a Buddhist perspective, I might be a little bit more lean towards celibacy as a really viable option than most do. I think that, most people think that sex is almost a necessity. I don't see it as a necessity. I really see it as a choice. And as I said before, I think that for many, when sexual relationships are approached in the right way, that they can be incredibly healing and insightful and useful part of our spiritual practice and our life. So a few more thoughts that I'll share with you is that there is, the Buddha said celibacy as a viable thing. And then he said, for those of us who are going to take what we call the householder's path, and we're going to be in relationships, there's places where he gives advice, of course it's pretty heteronormative, and he gives advice to husbands and advice to wives, and but just about like being honest with each other and taking care of each other's hearts basically and lives. And he says, there's 5 training precepts for the householder. The monks and nuns have hundreds of rules, and those are, you and I who say, I'm really interested in Buddhism, I want to follow this, I want this to be part of my life. He said there's five rules, and one is nonviolence, and the 2 of them are about honesty, not lying or stealing. One is about avoiding drugs and alcohol. He says if you really want to be mindful, it's a very important, and in order to uphold the integrity and the presence, to avoid drugs and alcohol. And then, there's the precept around sexuality. And it's very simple. The Buddha says, avoid sexual misconduct. Abstain from causing harm with your sexuality. And, from this bigger perspective, I think that he's very liberal about what that means to cause harm. But I think that it's important to include ourselves, to, talk about, is my sexuality not only harming others, but is it harming myself in some way? Am I creating suffering for myself? The traditional way that he talks about it is, again, it's just about honesty, not cheating, not lying, not manipulating, not having sex with someone else who's in a committed relationship, the cheating stuff, both breaking your own commitments or participating in someone else breaking their commitment. But my sense is that it's really open, consensual adults. There's not a lot of judgment of it. It's more of just encouragement to be mindful and be careful, and to really, enjoy yourself when it's appropriate, and to be careful for the ways that we might suffer unnecessarily in relationships. A couple more comments or questions here. Let me see. There's a long comment here. I don't know if everybody can see the comments. That I don't. It feels like it's too much for me. Feels like it's too much for me to comment on. But I like the essence of this comment about seeing the difference between pain and maybe a healthy sense of grief, and the aliveness that comes, and a kind of emotional intelligence. And I really do believe that that's a huge part of what happens for us when we become meditators, and we're using meditation not as an avoidance technique, but as a turning towards, is that we learn to feel our feelings and to have the healthy relationship to all of the human experience. There's a question here about how Buddhism and mindfulness can help with sex and love addiction. I think that's a pretty big topic that I have reflected on a little bit. I think that, renunciation is core. And, from a Buddhist perspective and these precepts, it's about abstaining from things that are causing us harm. And so periods of abstinence and celibacy can be quite healthy for some. And the more we meditate, the more we will change our relationship to the mind that is the, aspect of us that does the craving and the clinging and the addiction, especially process or addictions like sex and love, where you're not actually physically dependent, but there's a craving that arises over and over and over, and an addictive pattern to satisfying those cravings. So the more we can break our addiction to the mind, and the mind, insistence that we must have this sexual experience or this love experience, the more we can see that as impersonal and not your fault. Buddhism is quite good at normalizing the human experience. And in some ways, the second noble truth of Buddhism, and the Buddhist word is tanha, and it translates as something like an uncontrollable thirst or a repetitive craving. And that is the experience of addiction. And what the Buddha teaches, and what I've experienced and so many of us have experienced, is that through our own efforts, we can change our relationship to that craving, to that uncontrollable thirst. Now, it gets tricky, I think, around sex and love. And, with drugs and alcohol or other addictions, you, of course, can just establish abstinence and maintain abstinence. For something like sex and love, and I maybe should address them separately. Maybe you don't want to be completely abstinent. Of course, I don't think anybody wants to be abstinent from love. Love is important and healthy and super useful and healing for us, and necessary even. So it's about finding a balanced and healthy relationship to love. And in Buddhism, we have all of these meditation practices that we could maybe call self-love. We call them loving kindness practices, where we train our mind and we create neural pathways of self-love. And the more we can come to love ourselves, I think the less dependent on others, and the more we can break this fantasy that says I can only be happy, this craving that says I can only be happy if I'm experiencing love from the outside. And we come to understand that actually, if we can really fall in love with ourselves, if we can really care about ourselves and love ourselves, that then being in relationships and sexuality and love become really wonderful, and we're not so dependent on them, and we're not so suffering upon them. And maybe this is the difference, and it's a distinction I've been wanting to make in this talk about the difference between craving and desire. Because craving, I would say, is, addiction is craving, and addiction is craving is the thought or feeling that I cannot be happy until I satisfy this. I have to have it. My happiness depends on it. My sense of well-being depends upon satisfying this craving. It's a very intense experience that we all have had. Desire is quite different. Desire is I desire sexuality, I desire love, I desire a relationship, but I know that I don't need it for my happiness, that that's not the source of my happiness, that actually my own relationship to myself is really the source of my happiness, and that if I can do my own self-soothing and self-compassion and self-love, then I'll actually have something really wonderful to bring into a relationship. And, hopefully with somebody else that's doing that and taking responsibility for their own happiness and well-being. And then, in my mind, that's where the healthiest kind of relationships are. But I don't think that no matter how much we meditate, I don't think desire goes away. I don't think that desire is just so natural part of who we are. Craving is the delusion that says I have to have. Desire is much more realistic. It's a lower level that says I want, but I'll be okay with or without. And I think that that's really the ideal when we're talking about sex and love addiction, is developing that healthy desire and when it's appropriate to satisfy it, and training the heart and mind thoroughly enough that we're not stuck in the belief that I have to have. See another question here about what would be a good place to start for someone who does not practice mindfulness in his or her sexual experiences. Well, I think that meditation practice is necessary, that mindfulness, actually you have to do a formal mindfulness practice. You need to establish a sitting meditation practice. You need to come and either learn it from books or on the internet, or come, ideally I think you attend meditation classes with a teacher that knows what they're talking about, and be a little bit careful, because there's a lot of people saying they teach mindfulness that, in my opinion, they don't really know what they're talking about. But I think that taking mindfulness practice, I don't think you can just bring mindfulness into sexuality without some training. I really feel like mindfulness is a serious skill that is developed through sitting meditation. As the Buddha said, he starts with the sitting meditation instructions, and then he moves on to walking meditation instructions. And then he says, now that you've established this kind of mindfulness in your sitting and walking in a formal, disciplined meditation practice, now start to integrate this mindfulness that you've developed in your meditation into all of the activities in your life. So I'm not sure if this person who's bringing the question already has a sitting meditation practice, but I'd say that that's really the place to start. Start a meditation practice, and as you become more and more embodied, more and more mindful, more and more insightful about what's happening in you and around you, then you'll start to integrate that into, okay, now that I'm much more in contact with my emotions and sensations, when I'm engaging on all the different levels, whether it's flirting or it's, in a romantic situation already, or it's dating, or it's masturbating, or whatever it is. So I'm going to really bring this embodied awareness that I've learned through my meditation practice into this sensual experience. When I was in my 20s, and I had been celibate in my 20s, and there was a meditation practice that my father teaches called soft belly, and this kind of core somatic meditation where you try to soften your stomach, make sure that there's no tension being held in your stomach. And my friends and I used to joke about, is it possible to masturbate with a soft belly? And, it was kind of a joke, but then, in masturbation, I would often try to kind of experiment. Can I be embodied enough, relaxed enough during that tense, sexual, physical experience to actually have a relaxed body around the excitement? And so really just bringing that investigation into the body. And I do believe that a sitting meditation practice is necessary. I have a question here about refuge recovery, and will it ever treat sex and love addiction? The way that I wrote the refuge recovery book, I don't have direct experience with sex and love addiction, so I don't think I did a great job at it. But my sense is that the suffering that creates addiction and the repetitive craving that is addiction, whether it's drugs, alcohol, behaviors, sex, love, however it's manifesting, will be treated by mindfulness. Of course, this is my bias. This is what I've been spending my life doing personally and teaching. And so my sense is that the refuge recovery program, which is just core Buddhism. It is the Four Noble Truths. It is the Eightfold Path. And my sense is that it totally treats sex addiction. I know that this question is probably actually about our treatment center, refuge recovery treatment centers, where we at this point are just licensed to treat drug and alcohol addiction. But my sense is that I'd actually like to get our treatment centers licensed as mental health and not just drug and alcohol, because we see this quite a lot, and kind of people who are both sex or love and drug and alcohol dependent, and so we are already treating it, but not when it's the primary thing. And I think that Buddhism offers a perfect treatment for sex and love addiction. And I think that I might actually lean a little bit more towards celibacy for some people, at least for periods of time. And I'm not educated enough about sex addiction treatment to know if that is considered radical or if that's part of the treatment process. But I do feel that when you've really suffered about something and you're not able to find balance in it, that sometimes it's important to put it down for a while, at least have some space from it, and to really practice abstinence altogether. It seems like food addiction perhaps is the one place where they don't have that ability or that luxury of practicing abstinence. But I tend to feel like for sex addiction, abstinence is a viable and perhaps valuable, at least for periods of time. What we do see quite often is people switching, this human condition which craves for pleasure, and drug addiction and alcoholism is so much an epidemic in our country. I don't know what the numbers are for sex addiction, but millions and millions of alcoholics and drug addicts, and it comes out of this natural human situation, the survival instinct that craves for pleasure, and then we find drugs and they create pleasure, and alcohol and creates pleasure, and there's so much stress and pain in life and we want to avoid it, and so drug and alcohol addiction seems so rampant. And so many people that establish abstinence and begin the process of recovery begin switching from substance abuse or other behaviors to either addiction in sexuality, or at least a very unskillful relationship to it, where there's lying and there's manipulating and there's dishonesty and there's harm being caused around sexuality. And that that's just unfortunately common, and it's part of the problem with not bringing sexuality into our spiritual practice. And that's one of the things that I love about Buddhism, who's saying like, yeah, this is going to be a very, very important place to pay a lot of attention and to be really careful with and honest about. And that phenomena of switching addictions. So I'm starting to run out of. Let me look at my notes here. Maybe I'll spend the last few minutes, if there's no more questions, reflecting on pleasure is wonderful if we can relate to it in a healthy way. And we're so often ruining our good times by clinging. And the truth is, clinging is not even our fault most of the time. It's completely natural to cling. This is where over and over I will come back to the importance of learning mindfulness, learning non-attachment, learning how impersonal that clinging and craving is. And, from a Buddhist perspective, it just happens all by itself over and over and over. So in mindfulness, we bring attention to the present, what's happening in me, and how does it feel? And there's only 6 things happening in any moment. There's seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling sensations in the body, and then the contents of the mind, which include thoughts and emotions. And there's these 6 things, and these 6 things have 3 possible feeling tones. We would perceive any one of these 6 areas of our experience as being pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And left to its own devices, when the mind isn't trained, the survival instinct kicks in, and if it's pleasure, we cling to it, we crave for it. And if it's unpleasant, we push it away. We have resistance, maybe anger or fear to it. And if it's neutral, you have to check out your own relationship. Some people enjoy neutrality. Some people find neutrality hard to tolerate and go looking for some pain or some pleasure. So in each moment that we're mindful, we can actually choose, how am I going to relate to this pleasant interaction, to this unpleasant craving, to this neutral, not much is going on moment. That's when we really, from a Buddhist perspective, gain the free will to choose happiness. Pleasure is wonderful when we don't cling to it. Pain is not a problem when we meet it with compassion. And that this is the core of what we're trying to do in meditation. And it's just not possible to do without a meditation practice, without a long-term meditation practice. The Buddha said this is a radical path. It's one that leads against the stream, and that it takes a vigorous commitment to practice in order to go against the stream, against greed, against hatred, against delusion, and to recover. If we've entered into the addiction side of things, and to recover is going to take a lot of work for a long time, but that it's possible, that this recovery is possible, this mind training in non-attached appreciation is possible for anybody who's committed to doing the work. I see another question here. What things can you do for a partner who is not present during sex to help them start to become mindful without hurting their ego? Let me reflect on that for a moment. I mean, of course, my mind over and over just comes back to practicing meditation, mindfulness. Maybe there's some books that would inspire your partner to consider an embodied mindfulness practice. I think there's a deeper investigation for this person of why they're not present. Is there actually a dissociating going on? Is there some trauma around it? Is it being stuck in fantasy in order to get off or something like that? What's the core that's causing lack of presence? And when we're talking about our partners or we're talking about other people, I mostly take the perspective of, we can encourage, we can support, we can try to lovingly inspire without, trying to hurting their egos if possible. But that ultimately we actually can't do that much for others. People have to get that motivation. They have to want to be present. There's not a lot we can do to make somebody else want even something that's quite good for them. We all have had some experience that or another. So I don't know if I have much more. I think our time is about up. If there's any other thoughts from people attending or...
Great. I'm seeing a lot of thank yous in the chat window. Noah, thank you so much for joining us today. How can people get in touch with you? Do you have websites, Facebook links?
Yes, refugerecovery.com for the treatment center, refugerecovery.org for the meetings, and there's about 200 refuge recovery meetings happening around the country now. So there may be one in your area if you're not already familiar with it. And again, everybody's welcome at those recovery meetings, whether it's substance or behavior addictions or process addictions. So check those out. And then for Buddhist meditation teachings or retreats, againstthestream.org. And then, yeah, you might find me on Facebook or Instagram, stuff like that. Thanks. Happy to be here. Thanks. And check out what they're doing at the Center for Healthy Sex. I think it's a great organization.
Great. Thank you, Noah. And the recording of this of this webinar will be on YouTube. Our channel is youtube.com/Center for Healthy Sex. Hopefully we'll have that up within the week. Please join us next month, September 9th. Vicki Tidwell Palmer is going to deliver a lecture titled Boundaries After Betrayal, Helping Partners Move into Clarity and Empowerment. Again, Noah Levine, thanks so much for joining us today. Everyone, thank you for being here, and have a great day. Bye.
Bye.